policy, pathways, and roadblocks to a Green New Deal. We have 4 panelists this afternoon. 2 you can see on Skype. The first is J.B. Rule. He's the David Daniels Allen Distinguished Chair in Law and the Director of the Program on Law and Innovation, as well as the Co-Director of the Energy, Environment, and Land Use Program. Professor Rule is an expert in environmental, natural resources, and property law, and was named the Director of the Program on Law and Innovation in 2014. Before he joined Vanderbilt's faculty, he was the Matthews and Hawkins Professor of Property at the Florida State University College of Law. Our second speaker that is on Skype is Professor Jim Salzman. He's the Donald Bren Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law with joint appointments at the UCLA School of Law and at the Bren School of the Environment at UC Santa Barbara, and formerly held joint appointments at Duke University as the Samuel F. Mordecai Professor of Law and Nicholas Institute Professor of Environmental Policy. Our third speaker is Professor Alice Kaswan. Professor Kaswan is also the Associate Dean for Faculty Scholarship and a Dean Circle Scholar at the University of San Francisco School of Law. She is an expert on climate change and environmental justice and has written and spoken widely about climate federalism, addressing the appropriate roles of federal, state, and local governments in mitigating and adapting to climate change. And our final speaker is Professor Nicholas Briner. Professor Briner was an Emmett Frankel Fellow in Environmental Law and Policy at the UCLA School of Law from 2016 to 2018, and served as a visiting associate professor and environmental law fellow at George Washington Law School, where he co-taught courses on environmental and natural resources law. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So Jim and JB, we're going to start with you, and please feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. I just want to first check to make sure the sound is okay.
It's great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to the Journal for letting Jim and me, I'll thank the Journal on his behalf as well, letting Jim and me patch in by Skype. It allowed me to meet a family commitment yesterday, but it didn't prevent me from getting out to a place that Nick and Joyce and Gabe and Jim all recognize, a place a little bit outside of Nashville. Very excited to be a part of this symposium. I'm also very, very excited that this symposium will be where I announce my candidacy for president. I am going to be running as an independent, and I'm hoping this symposium can help me narrow down. I've narrowed down my platforms to 2 possibilities. And the first platform is I'm going to take full advantage of our vast fossil fuel resources. We're going to double the number of pipelines, drill all along the coast, expand our road system, and build concrete and steel seawalls on our coasts. I'm not sensing enthusiasm from this crowd. I better go to my other alternative platform. We're going to go all in on renewables. We're going to put expansive wind power and solar power on the ground. We're going to put wind power on our coasts. We're going to build a national high-speed rail system. We're going to electrify roads for EVs, like Gabe was hoping. We're going to build green seawalls, not concrete seawalls. We use marshes and dunes to protect our coasts from sea level rise. Now, those are very different platforms, but they're also alike in one respect. They are both environmental and land use permitting nightmares. Being green does not get you a pass under citing laws like the Endangered Species Act, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, NEPA, National Historic Preservation Act, 4F, licensing under all the primary laws, and the list goes on. There will be many opponents to the Green New Deal infrastructure. Environmentalists are one of the chief opponents of wind power. There's going to be NIMBY opposition, property rights opposition, opposition in red states and red cities, and competitors to these infrastructure modes will also oppose them. And over the last 50 years, Greens have developed a project opposition playbook that has lots of plays and lots of punch. You may say, but we've been building infrastructure all along. This can't be a big problem. We can do this too. It's not that easy. Most national scale infrastructure had the skeleton and much of the meat in place before 1970, when the federal environmental laws started rolling out. We've mainly been fighting over maintenance and expansion and replacement. Some examples: the Intracoastal Waterway was completed by the end of World War II. Most of the litigation under environmental laws has been over dredging, maintenance. Gas pipelines. In 1970, there were 600,000 distribution mains, 600,000 miles of distribution mains, and 252,000 miles of transmission lines. In 2017, we almost doubled the distribution mains to 1.3 million, but we only have 300,000 miles of transmission lines. Railroads. Railroad mileage in the US peaked in 1916 at 250,000 miles. In 2011, we had 140,000 miles, 50,000 miles of which had to be used as reduced speed because they were unsafe and incapable of maintaining higher speeds. The federal interstate highway system, right? So in 1980, we had 3 million miles of public roads in the United States. 2015, it was 4 million. In 1970, there were 2.7 million miles of paved roads in the United States. By 2017, it was 4.4 million. The interstate system was completed in 1992. Basically, there's been no new national scale linear infrastructure built in this country since 1970. No new type of infrastructure. Now, I think we've heard today, I was able to watch the previous panel, the Green New Deal Infrastructure Initiative has to be carried out quickly. We need to turn around greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and we need to be building adaptation infrastructure now to prepare for what is inevitable. Green New Deal is going to require vast areas for wind and solar arrays, thousands of miles of electricity transmission lines to get the power to people, tens of thousands of miles of new railroad right-of-way for the high-speed rail, offshore wind, and thousands of miles of coastal restoration in a green fashion. We have to get this done fast. Now, I spent 12 years in practice working on infrastructure permitting on both sides. My main focus of my work since then in academia has been these laws. And the bottom line to me is if we apply ESA, NEPA, 404, and so on, the way we do it today, we apply it to the Green New Deal, I could slow it down to a crawl, as could any lawyer with any expertise. And there's lots of them, and it's naive to think that they won't be hired to oppose Green New Deal infrastructure. So I think the Green New Deal needs a new green law, because the old green laws just won't work. The problem is that I think that the Green New Deal, new green law, is going to have to employ some strategies that are anathema to Greens, namely top-down, streamlined, and eminent domain, if it's going to be done fast and nationally. A few case studies to offer as examples. I don't know if many of you have heard of the Texas CREZ. It's the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone project that ironically was brought online under Governor Rick Perry. In 2005, the state enacted a law directing the Public Utility Commission to define these CREZ zones and an ambitious goal of getting 18,500 megawatts of wind power generating electricity. It was started in 2006, and amazingly, today, they have 2,400 miles of transmission lines been put on the ground. 465 miles of those are 345 kV, and 8,500 acres of right-of-way. Now, how'd they do it that fast? There was virtually no permitting required. The Texas grid, ERCOT, is not federally regulated. So there's no licensing that was needed by a federal agency to trigger NEPA and the ESA. There were no 404 permits needed. There were minor ESA, Endangered Species Act, ACP permitting issues, but they didn't stand in the way of anything, and they took no time to resolve. Within the state structure, the PUC dictated everything. It was extremely top-down. It was streamlined. There were very little public input and public hearings involved, and eminent domain used to obtain many of those 2,400 miles of transmission line. So it's an amazing infrastructure project, almost unprecedented since 1970, but it was nothing like what would happen to much of the Green New Deal infrastructure because of its unusual non-federal aspects and then the way the state handled it. Another case study is the New Jersey Shore Dunes project. After Hurricane Sandy, the state decided it needed to build green infrastructure to prevent storm surges from destroying as much of the built environment as happened in Sandy. They used eminent domain extensively. They built hundreds of miles of elevated sand dunes. The main pushback, though, was over the use of eminent domain. The New Jersey Supreme Court changed New Jersey eminent domain law so that basically the eminent domain claim, the jury has to take into account the benefits of the dunes and offset that against the reduced property value from loss of scenic view and loss of beach. There have been several recent jury awards, nevertheless, in which the juries awarded hundreds of thousands of dollars in eminent domain damages. We'll see what happens to those on appeal, but that kind of outcome could stop this kind of infrastructure project. The third case study is high-speed rail. The Federal Railways Administration oversees high-speed rail, and funding is fully subject to NEPA, ESA, all the federal laws. In Texas, in 1992, a license was awarded, actually to a client of my firm, to build high-speed rail between Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. It's called the Golden Triangle. It was about 10 million people. By 1994, it was abandoned. The eminent domain opposition was fierce, and Southwest Airlines lobbied like mad to stop it. In 2017, a private company got a new license, and there has been progress, at least in the permitting, but there is strong eminent domain opposition once again. In Florida, high-speed rail started in 2011. By 2014, a private entity built a line 84 miles between Tampa and Orlando, but the project has now been canceled and abandoned. California, I might let Jim cover this, there's too much to cover. The second greenest state in the nation, behind Vermont, of course. Lots of environmental issues in the early stages. And as you may have read, in February 2019, Governor Newsom said the 171-mile line between Central Valley and Bakersfield would be completed, but that's it, at least. The rest is postponed indefinitely. Last estimate I saw from the state is that to build the whole thing would cost between $60 and $100 billion, and the LA to San Francisco line, the crown jewel of it all, would not be complete till 2033. That's not a very happy story for high-speed rail, not very promising for a national high-speed rail network. The last case study I'll mention is certainly not a green case study. It's the border wall. The border wall is a very unique, situation. The litigation going on over the emergency declaration is one thing, but what many people don't know is that the legislation that authorizes the border wall, it's wrapped up in the Homeland Security legislation, has a provision in it that allows the Secretary of Homeland Security to waive all federal, state, and local laws in order to build the border wall. Nothing, and to use eminent domain. Nothing could be more top-down, streamlined, and use of eminent domain than that. So, what would a new green law for the Green New Deal look like? Good question. I think we need to carve out something like certified or approved or designated climate infrastructure. And we need to carve that out of the existing environmental law land use siting domain. It probably would need some level of federal preemption. These are going to be big linear projects. It probably will need federal eminent domain. And it probably will need some kind of special dedicated permitting process, kind of a one-stop process that could be streamlined in ways that we've seen used for other infrastructure projects after the Great Recession. This is going to put pressure on justice concerns that were discussed in the previous panel. It's not what the Green New Deal wants, but if the Green New Deal wants its green new infrastructure, it's going to have to come up with a different environmental law regime, I think, because it could be slowed down to a crawl by federal, state, and local opponents using federal, state, and local laws as they have been used for the last 50 years. I'm not at all suggesting that we adopt the border wall. That's pretty extreme. But clearly, business as usual is just not going to be good enough to get the Green New Deal Infrastructure Initiative on the ground fast and nationally. So I don't have it mapped out yet. I'm not sure I can by the time we need to submit essays for this. But my main point is we all need to be thinking not just about the Green New Deal, but about new green laws that get the Green New Deal infrastructure on the ground. Jim, I'll lateral over to you.
Thanks. Is the volume okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, JB set out very well the basic thrust of our piece. We started talking about this after a conference that was organized by the Environmental Law Institute of Wingspread. There, maybe some of the folks in the audience as well. And this strong argument was made by Mike Gerard that climate change poses an existential threat. And if in fact that's the case, environmentalists really not try to have and
Hold on 1 second. We're having some sound difficulties. This one? That?
Yeah, that's now muted. That might be beneficial.
Okay, go ahead. Can you not hear me now if I say to go ahead?
I can't hear anyone all of a sudden.
Let's turn on the microphone and advise them what we've done.
Can't hear anything.
Okay, we turned off.
Somehow muted all of you.
Yeah, we turned off.
can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay, that's it. They were able to mute my mic.
Okay.
Okay, so go ahead.
I'm gonna turn off our microphone so there's not interference and hopefully.
I was lateraling over to you, Jim. Sorry.
No, but can the folks in Vermont hear me?
Yes.
Give him a thumbs up, yes.
All right, you can hear me. I can't hear you. Maybe that's a good thing. So the point I'll make my point here for you, I'm going to get back to JD. The key thing that we're trying to get across in this project, this is like the first step in the larger project, is that we think that some hard choices need to be faced. People have described the Green New Deal as a Christmas tree. It talks not just about things that are obviously climate, but other social justice aspect as well. And maybe that's appropriate. But we don't think that there's been enough serious discussion of just how easy it is to block the Green New Deal. And so the key thing I'll say, and then I'll stop because I think the connections here are difficult, is that what we hope to do is to generate more of a discussion about some of these tough choices. So I'll stop there. Hopefully someone heard me. JB, you might keep cutting. I can't hear anything.
Time to unmute our microphone.
I can't. It's not working for some reason. Okay. Can you guys hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay. Jim,
I can't hear.
you were
I
fine.
can't. JB, you take over.
Okay, you were fine towards the end if you want to keep talking.
I'll pass it to JB.
Okay. Good. Uh-oh. I think JB is muted.
How's this?
Perfect.
Okay, sorry. Definitely don't put me in charge of technology. We're not trying to rain on the Green New Deal parade, but I think a big dose of realism is needed, as Jim pointed out, that it is a huge infrastructure project among many other things. And I think that, as the prior panel suggested, a strong component, as we know, of the Green New Deal is justice in many different fashions. And of course, those would be sensitivity to cultural lands, ensuring that the sort of impact of this infrastructure development is evenly felt across economic and social and cultural lines. That adds a lot of complication, to be perfectly blunt about it, to where we put the Green New Deal infrastructure. And if we allow every sort of opposition group to employ the kinds of laws that we have in place now, it could really slow it down. So I see a fundamental, as Jim said, a trade-off, a tension between the goals of the infrastructure component of the Green New Deal and some of the other social justice and economic justice goals. Now, of course, This massive undertaking is going to be good for jobs and job training, certainly a lot of economic output from the infrastructure initiative. But I think we need to start planning now how we would actually design the permitting program that gets it on the ground as sensitively as it can be put on the ground, given the other goals of the Green New Deal. And that's not something that's just sort of easy to pull out of the bag, so to speak. It's really nothing like what we've ever undertaken before, and we've never undertaken an infrastructure project of this scale. That's it for me. Oh, Vermont's muted again, sorry.
Now we're good.
Good. No, I can't hear Vermont, sorry.
Okay, hold on. It's not doing
Can you hear Vermont, Jim? No, I can't.
Hello?
We're muted. It's like not, the computer's not responding. Okay. Okay. Can you guys hear us?
Yes, the quality is poor.
Okay.
Looks muted.
Yeah, it looks like it's muted. Okay.
What do we do next?
Okay.
I have a PowerPoint, so we're gonna
Oh,
have to
okay.
get to
You
my
want to sit here?
PowerPoint. No, I want to stand.
Oh,
so,
okay.
but I need to get to my
We need to
PowerPoint.
pull up your PowerPoint. Okay.
That one's mine. There's.
What are we doing right now? Are we closing the Skype or?
Well,
I think they
Ask
want
them
to
if they
stay
want to
on.
listen.
and I'd like to be able to see my PowerPoint here, so I don't want to.
So keep them on. I'm gonna keep their volume low, advise them that that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Either text them a message or speak to them.
All right, we are now pulling up the next PowerPoint. So we don't see you on the screen at the moment. Thinking that's it.
Do you guys know where her PowerPoint is? Do you guys know where her, oh, okay, okay.
Hello. Yeah, yay, there it is. And I can't believe I actually got the picture that matched the picture they're using here, which I didn't know. I just chose that picture, so excellent. All is one. Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here. Mostly for me, it is just terrific to get to hear all of the other presentations and learn and think so much. I feel like I could revise this in 6 different ways just based on what I've already heard today. And I'm so impressed with the students, both in how they put this together and in all my conversations. So it's been a pleasure. All right, so at this point, we know that, let me see if my clicker's working. What do I point it at? I'm a big fan of just, I'm just gonna do that. I have a lot of these. Okay, at this point, we know the federal Green New Deal is, has been, and the resolution has been an incredibly important focal point, and it has inspired many, and it will continue to do so. But as David Roberts from Vox has suggested, at least in the very short term, we're unlikely to see a federal Green New Deal, and we're much more likely to see at least aspects of the Green New Deal and what it's trying to achieve come up in the states. And there are already, I think, a number of initiatives that have been inspired by the Green New Deal, still quoting David Roberts here on the slide. So I think these state initiatives, first of all, are important in their own right? So I don't want to discount them. And I also think they're going to be important to offering us some important insights into the shape of future federal efforts. So I first want to give a sense of just some of the state action that has exploded really in the last year. Now one of the problems with the United States is that we have oh God, I'm going to sound like a Californian. So many states in the middle, right? So this map doesn't look very full, but it actually includes a lot of population. And I don't mean to discount the states in the middle. I love the states in the middle. But they have lower, Texas, Florida, well, whatever. They have lower population generally. But really, we've seen quite a bit of action, and you see that list on the right, which are all those little countries up here in the states up here in the Northeast. So this is just looking at not the justice parts of the Green New Deal that I'll be talking about, but the ones that are seeking 100% clean or renewable electricity targets, which is, again, is at least the important green component here. Not all of them, but many of them adopted just this year, 2019, in this context. So just to give you a sense, again, of what's happening in the states, many of whom I think have been inspired in part by the energy around the federal resolution. My goal is not going to be talking so much about this whole burst in general in terms of the states, but to be looking more specifically at the climate justice aspect. So not as much the green, but at the justice aspects of this. So let me just give you an overview. I'm going to be sort of descriptive for a good part of this talk, just talking briefly about a number of the emerging state and local climate justice initiatives. And as Gabe so helpfully pointed out earlier, there are really a lot of different forms of justice that are implicated by by the Green New Deal and by a number of these initiatives. So I'm going to be talking about some of the overarching commitments that we see to equity, both environmental and economic equity, some discussion of co-pollutant benefits, clean transition benefits, economic protections, worker protections, as well as some procedural issues around the approach to developing specific plans that we see in some of these initiatives. I first want to just qualify, I have done a fair amount of work on California's climate justice initiatives, which have been the longest standing ones and the most farthest along in implementation. And I found some examples of what's going on in other states, but I'm sure there's more out there. I heard more even this morning about some initiatives that would be worth following up on. And then toward the end, I'll be just talking a little bit about what I think is the significance and value of having subnational action, right? Having the states and local governments take action, and then what some of these state and local actions might mean for moving forward in the federal arena. All right, so let's look at some of the comprehensive equity commitments that we see. California, I can't even start listing them. And if you look at AB 32, the initial Global Warming Solutions Act, there are quite a few expressions of the dedication of the state to achieving environmental and economic equity. We also had the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which continues to advise the primary committee on the primary agency responsible for developing the state's plans and give explicit attention to environmental justice concerns. We had dedicated funding out of cap and trade, which I'll talk about more later, but all expressing these commitments on a general level to environmental and economic justice. As was discussed a bit earlier, New York this last summer passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It gives an important role for its climate justice working group, a little bit like the EJAC, the advisory committee we have in California. Also, like California, it dedicates a substantial chunk of money to, or the spending that takes place for climate is to be devoted to disadvantaged communities, and again, a little more on the specifics later. Los Angeles has updated its sustainability plan and has some very compelling language. I'll read one of the key principles at the outset of the new sustainability Green New Deal in Los Angeles is to deliver environmental justice and equity through an inclusive economy, producing results at the community level, guided by communities themselves. We see later, not much later, but also in the goals section, the goal of prioritizing the needs and opportunities of disadvantaged communities, ensuring that the new green economy fulfills the promise of a more just and equitable economy. So again, these are some of the more general expressions that we see up front and center in the new legislation. So now I'll turn to some of the more specific justice-related provisions. This first one relates to co-pollutants, and I think this resonates with Gabe's discussion earlier of distributional justice and how that's a part of what's to be achieved here. And as we know, we have a strongly disproportionate existence for the fossil fuel industry and communities of color, low-income communities. So we're dealing with a lot of existing injustice in that context. And we know that greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuels are strongly correlated, and when we reduce greenhouse gases, co-pollutants are usually reduced as well. So a key issue in the environmental justice community looking ahead to climate policy has been how are we going to deal with the fact that the burden of fossil fuels has fallen disproportionately on disadvantaged communities, and we want to make sure that a fair share of greenhouse gas reductions occur in these frontline communities so that they benefit from health-improving co-pollutant reductions. And there's a fear, right, that some of the strategies we may take to address greenhouse gases might actually leave these communities behind. All right, so in California, we see specific commitments to complementing air quality objectives, right, so that as we go about achieving greenhouse gas reductions, we also want to achieve air quality objectives, and this is in a state that has some of the worst air quality in the country. In New York, again, the law just passed this last summer. There's a commitment to distributing emission reductions equitably, and emission reductions must not increase co-pollutant emissions, right? We don't want to have things like biofuels, right, that might lead to a net decrease in greenhouse gases, but ultimately lead to increases in co-pollutants. California has similar language as well. Washington State last year passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act, focused on the electricity sector and reducing power plant emissions, and instructed utilities, which will be responsible for the planning here, instructed utilities to reduce burdens in vulnerable communities, and specifically called for cumulative impacts analyses to identify those communities that might experience or might be experiencing these disproportionate burdens. And then also in Washington, a more general admonishment to the utilities that as they engage in their resource planning to reduce their greenhouse gases, that they should be considering both short and long-term public health and environmental benefits. Los Angeles as well, not just these general goals, but a plan to develop very specific strategies in the most contaminated neighborhoods to achieve very specific health improvement objectives, right? Reducing asthma, right, in some of these communities. So, so quite specific targets in that context, linking greenhouse gas reduction policies to health outcomes and co-pollutant reductions. All right, transportation I also want to talk about a little bit because pretty much transportation is an environmental justice issue because poor people and people of color live disproportionately in the places that are most exposed to transportation emissions, whether it's by highways or whether it's in ports, this huge issue in California where you have the diesel trucks and the ships coming in. And so we see in places like California, it's Clean Car Standard that is now under attack by the administration. That is very much, if you look at California's description of that, it is a multi-pollutant initiative. It is about both reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the Clean Car Standard, the requirements for zero-emission vehicles, and about reducing co-pollutants, and the two walk hand in hand. We also have in California a real attention to diesel under the state's short-lived climate pollutant program. So it turns out diesel is a kind of black carbon, which has particularly significant climate impacts. And so the state has developed a program for addressing these short-lived climate pollutants like diesel particularly, and that has, again, a combination of both very significant climate benefits as well as very important health benefits. So significant investments in helping to reduce diesel emissions. In Washington State, Washington is investing its VW settlement money in reducing diesel in the most impacted communities. So again, a marriage of climate and other initiatives. Okay, so that's one form of justice. It's dealing with this legacy of distributional injustice with co-pollutants. Another issue, which Gabe referred to in his discussion of Distributive justice is about economic protection, so I'm sort of bringing it down to brass tacks, right? We're talking about the risk that we're going to have significant price increases in places like Europe. When we talk about climate justice, they're worried about the economic justice issues in this context. And so in states like California, we have a range of investments that are designed to reduce electricity demand, right? So if you do more in energy efficiency, if you do distributed solar, for example, the goal is, or the hope is, that you will be reducing demand for electricity so that even if the rates go up, you'll be using less, and so your bill won't go up, or if anything, it might even go down. So that's an initiative that's certainly the nature of some of the investments, and the reasoning behind some of these investments is actually economic protection. That's one of the justifications. Also, in California, we have numerous limits and programs to assist with bills. So if they do go up, there are ways to try to protect folks from the higher costs. In Maine, we see general language. Maine, again, just passed legislation this year, Green New Deal legislation, that requires planning to consider community impacts, and we're going to assume those include the economic impacts here. In Washington, really extensive program to provide the same kind of energy assistance. So utilities are expected to invest in weatherization, energy efficiency, even distributed solar, partly to help low-income folks reduce their energy bills. And expected particular goals. This is not window dressing, expected to end up reaching 60% of those in need by 2030. Seems a little far off, 90% by 2050. But it's not just we're going to have a program and, oh, we have a program, but it only reaches 5%, right? Really attempting to get penetration to all those who may need this assistance. Other programs, Los Angeles specifically talks about implementing cost-saving programs to alleviate financial burdens in our most vulnerable communities. So a recognition, and at least on paper, attempts to address these issues. All right, so that's economic protection. And then another form of justice, oh, Gabe, which kind was this? Distribution of benefits, who's clean energy transition, right? So we have this question about who is going to benefit. It's not just about dealing with past harms, but about who shares in the benefits. And I think this is at least partly still a distributive justice question, but who gets to benefit? Who's going to have the fancy solar panels? That's a Tesla symbol? Everybody knows that's a Tesla symbol, right? Who's going to have the fancy electric cars? And who's going to be left with the house that's uninsulated, that's paying for an expensive air conditioner and hot, or the gas-guzzling car that's going to have to pay the increasing gas costs if we put on a carbon tax, right? So I think this raises issues partly of distributional equity, but it's also partly about a sense of inclusion and our participation, right? A sense that, we're talking about this great clean transition and who gets to be a part of it, and a sense that some people might want the chance to be a part of it but not have the means to do so. So it's not purely just about who gets what, but also about a sense of participation and engagement in a transition. All right, so Washington State, again, in its recent legislation, has a legislative commitment to equitable distribution of benefits like charging infrastructure, right? It shouldn't just be at the Whole Foods in a rich neighborhood, it should be in poor neighborhoods too. And energy efficiency investments that should be spread broadly. And then I mentioned some of the programs I mentioned earlier have double purposes, right? So the efforts to protect people from increasing costs like energy efficiency investments and distributed resources to disadvantaged communities also are about distributing benefits and allowing a sense of inclusion. And then we have the money. So I mentioned earlier that California is required to dedicate 35% of the revenue from its cap and trade program to benefit disadvantaged and low-income communities. Many would say California's cap and trade revenue is much less than it ought to be, that we ought to be selling a lot more allowances and all the rest, but it has still generated $12 billion to date, right? And this money is being distributed for various purposes to communities in need. Lots of questions about whether it's being done in the best way, whether it could be parlayed in a more, I have questions about whether it could be parlayed in a better way. But it is an influx of money dedicated toward helping disadvantaged communities address the consequences of climate change and invest in mitigation. So a lot that's very valuable there. And then in New York, it's even more. This was, again, legislation that's just passed. Very curious to see how this will be implemented. But there is a commitment in the law that not just 35% of a market-based system's revenue go to disadvantaged communities, but that 35% of all spending, all climate spending, be devoted to clean energy and energy efficiency benefits in disadvantaged communities. And then, to the extent practicable, going beyond that, up to 40% of all spending go for an even wider range of benefits, including housing and workforce development and economic development. So again, that is an enormous commitment, and it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out, how it's implemented, how the criteria is set up. Portland, Oregon has done a different way of generating funds. They have a tax on large retailers who make a lot of money, and that's being used to fund some of the low-income sustainability initiatives in the city. Okay, and then energy benefits. We've got various investments in solar, distributed solar, not coming out of cap and trade revenue, but out of other sources in California, in Illinois. In Maine, we have an incentive program for community shared distributed energy and energy efficiency commitments that are in some of the laws. Access to clean cars. I don't want to imply clean cars are the only way to go. I think there's lots of other kinds of investments that are very important in the transportation context. But it's kind of a symbol, I think, to some degree. So California reserves its state rebates only for people of moderate and low income. They're not available to people of high income. And so Oregon has a charge ahead rebate program that is specifically dedicated to low income. I'm going to have to go fast. Worker provisions, the issues are both just transitions, corrective justice, as Gabe was calling it, and new opportunities for disadvantaged communities. Maine has a general provision about promoting jobs and economic benefits for their residents. Washington State has an interesting program that they're not going to help utilities with incentives. They're really based on the job criteria that they have, so trying to get high-quality jobs here. Los Angeles, a duty to ensure we get good jobs. To say that quickly. I'm just going to put these all out there. There's some cool stuff more about job programs in different states. Planning process, I think a really important question, and this is in a lot of tension with what JB and Jim were just talking about, is kind of who ends up deciding about how we move forward. You can have some general principles in the law, and 3 states have said we need to have a sort of somewhere before rulemaking a planning process that brings in stakeholders, often brings in environmental justice communities to say, what do we want our state to look like? And I think thinking about how do we have that kind of integration and participation while also having speed is going to be a hard question. Where do we just move forward directly? Where do we have some kind of planning that allows us to really think about where are we going and what is our future? And that's a tension I look forward to thinking more about. I'm ignoring that. So I think the Green New Deals are going to be very valuable, both on their own terms, they're capitalizing on and feeding momentum for change. I'm going to just put this out here. You can read it faster than I can say it. The last point is really that no action is better. Some action is better than no action. But I think we definitely have to have federal action, and that federal action ought to play a role. That in that federal legislation, we still have to have a role for the states, and we need to be thinking about that. And that's what I'll end on. So, bye. Sorry about that. I think I'm the only one who ran over.
Oh, wait, actually, I'll go down there.
I can.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, go.
Okay.
Do you want me to pull up your
I can get it. Is this yours, Alice?
No.
No. Okay, I'm going to take a second to get situated here.
There's so much to be thinking about. Yeah, you should just be if you go down there.
Yeah. I'm just going to pull up something else first.
Okay. Oh, I even had a data for progress chart that showed interest in, while you're setting up, you're still setting up?
I'm going to start talking before I pull it, but go ahead if you wanted to say something. Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. It's really been exciting for me to be able to come to Vermont and to share in this day with all of you and to listen to all of the presenters who have gone so far. And so I want to thank especially all the students on the law review who've done such a great job organizing this, as well as everyone else here for coming. And I hope you'll indulge me for just a second while I pull up a picture.
Hopefully it works.
If it loads. Not sure. Okay, so this is a picture of my dad. In 1992, spent the summer here. So I was 8 years old at the time and spent several weeks here in Vermont. And my mom sent me this picture this morning. So right after getting it, I went to go recreate the picture. So yeah, so I'm glad to be able to be here and do that. And now I'll get to my presentation. And before I get into the heart of it, there's a couple things I want to say in general about the Green New Deal, and I think in dialogue and in response to several of the things that the other presenters have said. It's been exciting to me over the past year to see the ways in which Green New Deal proponents have been successful in driving a new conversation about socioeconomic policy as well as environmental policy and climate change, in large part because the ideas are coming from different voices and perspectives that have not previously been part of the environmental coalitions that have driven legal and regulatory change for the past 50 years. A lot of the prominent Green New Deal advocates are young and are led by women of color. And I think this has brought a valuable perspective in considering the integration of social policy and environmental policy. So of course the Green New Deal has been met with a lot of opposition from conservative leaders in media, but has also been met, I think, with some skepticism from the center and the left as well. And I think that skepticism is rooted in misplaced misapprehension about the scope of the Green New Deal and Green New Deal discourse. Traditional environmentalist groups and I think climate hawk coalitions as well tend to focus on the top line decarbonization goals and the absence of nuts and bolts policy development in the Green New Deal. And I think that focus misses the Green New Deal forest for the climate trees. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Green New Deal as social policy, as a recognition that any climate policy necessarily and unavoidably includes social policy choices with socioeconomic trade-offs and distributional justice implications for those who are most vulnerable to climate harms, and also for those who are most vulnerable to displacement in a decarbonized economy. And with that in mind, a successful legal framework for a Green New Deal will have to be interconnected with environmental and climate goals tied to socioeconomic equity, labor-sensitive, and distributive justice outcomes. So I say all of that because I appreciated and I find it very thought-provoking, JB and Jim's presentation. And in dialogue with that, and I think partially in response, I think the discussion around climate as an existential threat is valuable, but it's not the first and not the only existential threat for frontline communities. And Mary Hegler of NRDC has written very passionately about this over the past year and raised attention to this. And one of the potential dangers with kind of considering climate change in that mindset, in that frame, is that it can also play into the same sorts of pitfalls that have been pervasive in colonialism, in infrastructure development, and development that goes not just as far back as the Industrial Revolution, but mercantilist ways of thinking about development that go back several hundred years. I think it's very apt for JB to start out by kind of comparing the two different visions of his presidential platform and how those might have some more similarity than we might originally give them credit for. And I think as a cautionary note to dealing with the Green New Deal is recognizing that those may sound similar to communities that are at the front line or communities that have been traditionally marginalized from the infrastructure planning and development process, such that undertaking radical new development of infrastructure in those places without consultation and without some different mechanism for dialogue, recognizing that that would be very difficult under existing environmental land use statutes, may not be able to generate the same type of social benefits that I think need to be integrated with climate and environmental considerations. So what I want to talk about here as well, if this will scroll through, I'm going to skip through a few things to mention a little bit about what I think could orient law for a Green New Deal by looking at the ways in which we have done legal transitions and regulatory transitions in environmental law. And rather than focusing on NEPA and the Endangered Species Act in Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, I want to look at the Clean Air Act in a little bit in more specifics as well, and the ways in which we have failed or had run into challenges and roadblocks in trying to transition from perhaps more polluting sources to reduced pollution levels, and talk about some of the lessons for that. So as I skip through everything about the Green New Deal, because you know all of this already and have heard it all day, the integration of social and climate policy goals means that you're really talking about transitions in a lot of different sectors. And we focus a lot on capital transitions, in the transitions in which you'd be thinking about moving from fossil fuel infrastructure to renewable energy infrastructure, and from transportation systems oriented around cars to better, more efficient more climate efficient as well, or electrification of transportation systems. Land use transitions, as we think about the transitions that would be needed in agriculture. So we haven't talked about food, but I think we can also talk more about the role of agriculture in decarbonization as a significant sector that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. But in talking about those transitions, labor transitions are also equally important. And I think that's the core of the Green New Deal mindset, is that no one of these transitions occurs without the other, and they all need to be recognized together. So just as an illustrative list of the types of major transitions involved in decarbonization, it's everything from electricity generation to resource extraction to agriculture to industry to transportation, urban planning and building construction, and so much more. I mean, I can't fit it all on one slide. And if you think about what these transitions look like, they involve so many major shifts and involve pluses and minuses, both from a socioeconomic standpoint as well as an environmental standpoint. Decarbonization of electricity generation includes a variety of different facets that might have positive local impacts, positive global impacts, negative local impacts, and negative global impacts. So from a variety of different scales, and whether you're talking about socioeconomic or environmental dimensions. If you're not thinking about all of those things in an integrated, holistic manner, you're not going to be ensuring really a just outcome. So similarly, decarbonization of transportation will involve a lot of high upfront costs and can also result in the displacement of a lot of jobs, not just in auto manufacturing, but in car repair and gas stations and all sorts of things that are, I think, areas of displacement that we don't necessarily talk about as often as other areas. Fuel switching in residential and commercial buildings, decarbonization and fuel switching in industry, which is something that we haven't really figured out very well how to do either. That has pretty significant importance energy efficiency improvements, reducing greenhouse gases from agriculture and other sectors. How did you think about education and healthcare and housing and other social infrastructure transformations and transitions over those same time frames? And the kind of the value of Green New Deal discourse is that as inequality policy, as social policy, there's a recognition that climate, in fact, it affects those social justice issues. And so it's a way of mainstreaming thinking about environmental and climate change issues from a social policy lens that can serve as sort of a counterweight to market-oriented ways of thinking about environmental issues that can kind of generate some dialogue about what are the best ways to move forward. So with all of those transitions in mind, I want to talk about how we've managed transitions in environmental policy and why. And I'll come back to this slide in a second. A lot of regulatory transitions involve transition relief. So how do we manage those transitions and sort of ease the burden in transition from one sector to another, or in imposing new technological requirements or pollution control requirements? Financial relief takes the form of tax relief or subsidies or grants. There's also temporal relief, phase-in and delays in grandfathering. Why do we have transition relief? There are a lot of factors that push toward this, that gravitate toward transition relief, that slow down transitions as well as smooth them. Political pressure and fairness concerns and cost are all intertwined. There's the traditional economic argument. We use transition relief because we want to reduce the upfront costs of regulatory transition. So we're going to focus on the new sources rather than the existing sources in order to reduce how much we have to do right at this moment, and it's going to be phased in over time. Fairness arguments get made about whether it's fair to change the rules for existing industries in the middle of the game. And the question that I think is highlighted here is fairness to whom? If you kind of deconstruct these transition policies, fairness in delaying environmental regulation or delaying the implementation of new environmental rules is constructed around fairness to industry or fairness to capital without paying attention to fairness to labor in the same way that we do to the capital sector. Political pressure, as exhibited by public choice theory, existing industries are also likely to favor transition relief because it can create an artificial barrier to entry for new actors. So you see this play out in a lot of changes. Anytime there's some incremental change in environmental law, the coalition may even be brought between environmental groups and existing industries that support new regulation because it may not apply to them, or because with some exemptions, it can create even greater hurdles for competition. So it can create an anti-competitive effect. So criticisms of all of these from 4 different perspectives, I think, offer lessons for how to construct a Green New Deal. First, from an equity perspective, transition relief, kind of paying too much attention to try to smooth out transitions, in effect delays them by placing the burden entirely on new actors to pay for the costs of previous activity. Communities are not given any relief from past harms, and fairness arguments are often skewed toward existing industry. From an efficacy standpoint, delays or limits on how transitions apply and how transitions work create advantages to maintaining or using old sources or equipment or infrastructure. And I'll get to this in a little bit. Some examples of how this is played out in the Clean Air Act has really limited the effectiveness of several air pollution control programs and has created incentives for coal-fired power plants to continue to operate longer, and kind of the worst polluting sources have their lifetime extended because of the imposition of new regulation that would impose new costs on new sources. And from a political coalition standpoint, partial or incomplete transition can alienate communities or other potential supporters of transition. And I think there's a need, and the Green New Deal reflects this, to reorient the types of political coalitions that have supported environmental policy and environmental law. And it creates a new opportunity to think about how to work across different lines to create a more durable coalition that could create some more lasting changes beyond just putting in place a new regulation. And one of the ways to deal with this is by changing the ways in which we think about triggers or phase-in points for environmental law. So phasing out coal and natural gas-fired power in favor of renewable energy, phasing out internal combustion engines in favor of electric vehicles, phasing out the use of highways toward more mass transit opportunities. When those triggers or phase-in points are designed ambiguously or without care, they can create future opportunities for rent-seeking behavior because existing industries have extremely large financial incentives at one critical point in time to seek to maintain the benefit that they have. So an example of this, under the Clean Air Act, in 1977, the Clean Air Act added a pre-construction permit process known as New Source Review. New Source Review applies only for new or modified sources that are then required to install best available control technology in areas that are in attainment for Clean Air Act, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or lowest achievable emission rate standards for those that are in non-attainment, in the kind of already worst polluted air areas. So that grandfathering in the New Source Review program has made pollution reduction more costly, less effective, less equitable for frontline communities, and has also hindered innovation. And one of the challenges for thinking about Green New Deal, as Alice and I were talking about yesterday, and I'll credit to Alice for this thought, is that a lot of the existing policies that we've had have been oriented around kind of incremental changes with the idea that industries would continue to operate, but in some modified way. So we impose pollution control requirements on petrochemical facilities or power plants or other types of stationary sources with the idea that they're going to change the way they operate, but environmental law like the Clean Air Act was not designed to shift from one type of source to another source, or to shift from one type of activity to another type of activity. It's just a change in regulation of how that activity works. And so that's, has created, I think, problems that we need to work around and think differently about when designing Green New Deal. So under the New Source Review program, exemption from regulation is a tremendously significant and valuable major financial asset. One study estimated that it could be worth as much as $150 million for a single coal-fired power plant to not be considered a modified plant that would be subject to new source requirements. One study done as far back as from 1969 to 1983 concluded that these changes in 1977 increased the average age of power plants by over 3 years because it gave an additional incentive to maintain that benefit. For cars, we've seen similar types of issues. Cars operate on a much faster time frame. They're replaced more frequently than power plants. However, a study in 1982 concluded that increased NOx and carbon monoxide regulations increased emissions in the short term because they increased the average life of car by 4 years, delaying turnover. Fuel economy standards, while not originally designed for environmental purposes, also focus only on new cars with no effect on old vehicles, and that can create some effects that hinder the effectiveness of these types of programs. So what are some solutions to these types of transition problems? Well, I think there are several, and they're somewhat intuitive, but politically difficult to manage within the existing environmental law structure that we have. You can reduce transition relief, so to think about just not smoothing that transition at all and saying, we're going to completely eliminate or shut down this type of activity or this type of car engine or whatever the case may be, or this type of agricultural production. You can mandate retrofitting. Again, that's expensive, but it may be worth committing the investment as much as we invest in resources to deal with new sources of pollution. How do we address those existing sources? Some of the ways in which that has been done with cars is to have cash for clunkers programs where you trade in the cars. It's not even retrofitting. It's cheaper at this point to just pay to get the car off of the road and incentivize people to use better, less polluting technology. You can use markets to do this as long as you're doing it in tandem with other types of policies. But having a clear phase-in program that doesn't provide for the same ways of gaming the system that encourages litigation and lobbying to kind of kick the can further and further down the road is all really important. So one just last slide I'm going to show since I'm out of time is this from the Pathways to Deep Decarbonization report that Jim Williams and several other authors in California prepared in 2015, looking at deep decarbonization in the United States by 2050. This chart shows you the number of replacement opportunities for various different types of investments. So between, and now we have few years less of time, not as much time as even is shown on this chart, pretty much all of the existing residential buildings that are already built now are still going to be in place by 2050. So we have to think about how to retrofit all of those, in addition to putting in place new standards right away for new buildings. Electricity power plants, we might have a chance to replace them once by then. Cars will have a chance to replace a couple of times. But if we don't start soon to get these transitions in place, this is just to decarbonize by 2050. If you want to do anything any faster, you have to be acting even more quickly. So I think these lessons provide some valuable information about how to design new policies that can work with a greater degree of efficacy and also simultaneously better equity and better distributive justice outcomes than what we've seen under the first generation of environmental laws that were enacted 50 years ago, which have had a lot of success, but I don't think we'll be able to meet these same kinds of challenges over the next couple of decades. Thank you, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Were you gonna call him? Okay. Okay. Got it. We're so 21st century.
We're just gonna try to get Professor Rule back on before we open up for questions. Hey.
Everybody loved that music.
Sit tight, everybody.
If you have any questions for JB, I'll answer them.
Professor Rule, can you hear us?
Oh, he's here now, okay.
Oh, great. Okay. If it's okay with everyone, I had a question that I was gonna kick off the questions with. Is that okay for you guys? Okay. So I would say when we heard JB talking, we heard a tremendous focus on the need for speed and a top-down approach. And I think both of you reflected a need for there to be sort of more participatory processes, which obviously take a tremendous amount of time. So I'm wondering, is there a way to marry those two things and think about how to do things quickly, but also allow for those good consultative processes, but also to allow for things to fizzle up from the grassroots? Because my sense is that some of the top-down approaches are not going to be the right approaches for certain communities, and that they would like to have the opportunity to shape and craft those solutions. So is there a way to marry all of these approaches, or are they sort of fundamentally at odds with each other?
I can start. Good question.
Yeah, that's the million
No, I mean, I think I expressed that I feel like this is something that really requires more thinking through, like where, exactly where. But I think that there may be some things that we can say absolutely have to be top down. You know, I mean, we don't build a new coal-fired power plant, and we may even cancel natural gas pipelines, right? You know, so there's certain things that I think that we would say are simply not consistent with the decarbonization we need to achieve, and so in particular things that we would not do. In terms of what we do, in terms of building out alternatives, I think there's some room for top-down when it comes to federal lands and things where there's direct federal jurisdiction. I still think that that there is room for federal control, like ways to stop things that could go quickly. In terms of building new infrastructure and how we do that, I guess we'd have to go through each type step by step. I still think some level of planning about what you're going to do and then what speed you need to do it with would be appropriate. I think you might actually have more buy-in to the speed if you've had some planning that goes around it that says, no, we've come to a decision that this is our corridor, and we've had a chance to look at the trade-offs of different corridors, and we made the choice for this corridor, and now that's it, and I'm sorry. So I think that, I think you really have to work through each of the different kinds of infrastructure and different kinds of questions that are implicated by each type before you decide how quick you need to be. I also think we have big questions about large scale versus small scale, distributed versus centralized, and we've got to do some thinking about that before we just jump into a certain kind of investment, because there are a lot of ancillary issues that are associated with it. So, and then I think there's a lot of planning around how we do justice. So, I mean, I'm all for, like, let's just jump into spending money on helping poor people. I think we could go straight to it, you know, without having to have a lot of deliberation. So, initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think I would agree with all of that. I think there's probably not one answer to that question that applies across the board. I like that idea that there are certain things that are probably non-negotiable if it's easier to say what not to do. But yeah, planning is, I think, really important in order to deal with that, and recognition that these, I mean, I think first and foremost you're talking about socioeconomic justice issues that require planning and a lot of real engagement with communities. And I don't really think, it's hard for me to see a little bit extra speed as really being justified in that circumstance, notwithstanding the importance of addressing climate change. I'm not in any way suggesting that it's not an urgent problem to deal with, but I don't think the benefits of prioritizing that above all other considerations, prioritizing speed over all other considerations is really, I don't really see that as being the right approach or the most beneficial approach.
Well, I'll jump in and advocate for speed, the time version of it, of course. So every year we don't implement infrastructure alternatives. It's not just 1 year that we push back the sort of inflection point. I mean, it's a sort of, I don't know what the exact ratio is, but delay now is not simply just the equivalent delay later in terms of when we turn the arrow around on climate change. So there is a need for some level of speed. Let's put it this way: we can't implement the Green New Deal infrastructure that's aimed at greenhouse gas reduction at the same speed we have been sort of battling over an extension of the interstate highway system or a pipeline here or a pipeline there. And as for adaptation, I think we're seeing increasingly in their reports after report recently that the effects of climate change are taking hold faster than anyone thought they would. And so each year of delay on adaptation infrastructure is putting frontline communities and all communities at risk. So speed, I think, is one of the elements in this Green New Deal infrastructure initiative that does set it apart from business as usual, and we are going to have to deal with the need for speed. I think there's a movie by that name, but how do we do that and also integrate the kinds of concerns the prior panel and Alice and Nick have very elegantly articulated and compellingly is the million-dollar question. And one of the big problems with linear infrastructure is you can't let, and this is the obvious point, it's a line. It doesn't work if you don't fill in all the gaps. And it would be very difficult, I think, to pull off a coastal adaptation project. I mean, it's got to work. You can't have gaps. That's why New Jersey just said, we're building these dunes, whether you like it or not. We are going to have to say that to communities. And when it comes to saying that to frontline communities, I don't know how we actually do that in a way that's been fully planned to everyone's satisfaction. This is really an unprecedented challenge. We don't have any template to pull off the shelf to do this. We are going to have to really think it through. I agree that it's probably infrastructure type by infrastructure type. The speed is going to be different for each, but I think we need to sort of accept the reality that this is, if we're going to do it, we might as it can't take 100 years. It can't take 50 years. It can't take 25 years. We need to get these projects underway now or as soon as possible and build them out. High-speed rail is going to make a bit of difference in greenhouse gas reduction by providing alternatives to highways and airplanes if it's not on the ground and relatively soon. Coastal restoration is not going to, look at the last 5 years. We can't tolerate that any longer. It's putting all sorts of communities at risk. I think we need to have a real conversation about how we do this, and it cannot be business as usual.
Thank you.
Raise your hand up.
Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending, and all of the panels have been great. I have two questions. One, for the issue of for the policy like procedural justice, at the local level, there really is a mechanism that works to discourage participation by the very marginalized groups that are really harmed by environmental justice. And most of the time, it takes place at the local or state level. And the example I'll give is that when a municipality decides, hey, we want to set up an industrial facility at the corner of 8 and Main, they don't ever say that in their notice. They put out a notice that reads like the Magna Carta, and nobody goes to that. And every city does this around the country. So how can we push to democratize the way that everyday course of business is conducted when it comes to these kinds of decisions? Because these decisions are often made oftentimes 15, 20 years in advance. And then by the time the word gets to the ground on people in the community, they have to then rush to protest and rush to fight. But by that time, the decision is made. So I want your thoughts on that. The second question, I think, is a question of framing in terms of the speed of trying to implement some of the proposed ideas in the Green New Deal or other environmental policies given a short time scale. And it seems to me that the problem of framing is that we don't view climate change or we don't view pollution for what it really is, as a problem of a shared burden. We view this as some people have to deal with this, I don't. But we have examples where when we viewed these problems as shared burdens, we've been very successful at them. We viewed sanitation as a shared burden now, so we pay for garbage for everybody, most municipalities. We view the access to sewage disposal as a shared burden for the most part in urban areas, which is why we have safer and cleaner streets. And on a private sector side, when you look at the proliferation of cell phone towers, although that's an aesthetic shared burden, but the providers quickly understood they didn't want to get into these fights about unsightly cell phone towers, so they had to find a way to make these towers as inconspicuous as possible on their own, thus minimizing this idea of an eyesore that many communities did not want to have. And we see how cell phone service has proliferated because of that. So, in other words, how can we change the narrative on climate change, on climate action, to view it as a shared burden, and therefore bypass this idea, well, it's not my problem, so why should I invest in trying to solve it?
Go ahead.
Oh, no, well,
Okay. I have some thoughts, but I didn't want to be the first one to necessarily
I
respond.
did first, last one, you could do first.
Okay. Thank you so much for those questions. I think those are really very important questions and get right at the heart of some of the biggest challenges. To your first point about what happens at the local and state level in procedural issues, I think you've really touched something that's of critical importance, that we're talking a lot about how things work top down from a federal level or even from a statewide level. And I think at the core of what the type of reform that's needed in the Green New Deal is really a pretty deep change in the power structure of how those decisions are made at every level. And the local level is extremely important in that regard as well. So, how do you do that? I think it involves some significant degree of mobilization around that issue where everybody recognizes that as part of their shared commitment. And I think your second question in part answers your first question. If you get people to think about it as a shared burden, then those decisions become a little bit more democratic and a little bit more participatory. Part of the rhetoric around the Green New Deal considers the mobilization as like a wartime mobilization. And I have my own issues with that analogy, but I think it serves some, it's not a perfect analogy, but it does have some purpose in framing that, that this is as much about convincing people that this is all of our collective responsibility for our community and for our country to really transition and think differently about the way we make these decisions, which is just a lot of rhetoric that doesn't answer your question. And I think if I knew the answer, then we would all be doing it.
Yeah, I'll concur on what excellent questions those are. I think I've often struggled as someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about environmental justice, about how important empowerment is, and what a conundrum it is to think about, how do we achieve empowerment for those who don't have power, right? And I want to be careful not to romanticize the local level, because I think a lot of our environmental justice problem is really the fault of land use planning at a local level, and I don't think it's just a historic issue, it's a present issue. So we have very entrenched patterns of segregation and disproportionate land uses that I think could continue as we move down the line if we're not careful about it. So I think we need to have, again, local participation, because I don't think you can just have it be all top down, but with some very straightforward, some very strict guidelines to it. So whether it's a sort of NEPA-like thing that you have to evaluate impacts, or it is actually even stronger than that, that you can't concentrate impacts, I think in both adaptation and mitigation, we do need to have some overarching laws that establish both principles and parameters for local decision-making as a way to buttress the power of people who might otherwise be marginalized. I mean, that's the problem. You're marginalized, so how do you become demarginalized? And sometimes I think you need a higher level jurisdiction to give you a push in the power structure. In terms of the shared burden, I mean, unfortunately, I think that climate change operates on the surface differently from sanitation and sewage, because we all have sanitation and sewage, but right now the impacts of climate change are felt disproportionately. I mean, they're felt differently depending on where you live and what's going on. Now, I would love to start thinking that it's affecting enough of us and visibly enough that we can think about a national mobilization, and we can that we can inspire people to want to share in a collective effort. So I don't want to give up on that as part of what we have to continue to do every day, is to inspire that sense of shared mission and collective energy for good, right? But I also think that there are some meat and potatoes, like, well, if you don't care about that, then, and that's what we're going to pay as taxpayers. You know, what's going to happen to our spending on the things we care about if all of our money goes into disaster aid or into other things? And we have to get people out of harm's way, or we have to, you know, whatever. And then I also think we can appeal a little to the freedom of our grandchildren, right? You know, what are we leaving? It's like, well, you may not feel like this is a big deal now, but what are we going to do to our grandchildren if we don't act now? And so I think a little, I don't know, it's the Jewish mother in me, the guilt tripping, whatever, but, you know, is that a message that works or not? I don't know. We need our data for progress polling to figure that out. But, you know, even if you feel like it's not bothering me now, you know, think about what your grandkids are going to face. So that's a couple thoughts. Yeah.
So my question is more so regarding two different things. One, we mentioned co-planning and the power of states. What are your thoughts, firstly, on regional grid operating? So the production and generation of energy regionally and the elimination of a national grid. Not the pure elimination of it, but essentially moving markets in that direction to provide energy security at a local level. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I just think it might be an interesting thing, and a couple of utilities have expressed interest in essentially moving in that direction. And then another thing to add to that is we keep talking about, I've been really blessed to have a really strong environmental education, and that has allowed me to understand things in ways that I don't think everyone gets to see, just like if you had a business degree, it lets you see economics in a way that I probably never will understand. But the one question that I have is that when we're talking about engagement of these frontline communities in the local process, it's one, in addition to just the lack of notice or being able to comment, it's also that when you are commenting, your ability to express or truly understand the implications of what you might be agreeing to. And I think that goes back to education and how if we do want everyone to have, like, the goal is everyone's satisfaction in the way that we move. But in order to assess everyone's satisfaction, most people need to have a say. But if you raise the bar of what people know, if you raise education, or at least environmental education in some way, through the Green New Deal, I don't know, I feel like providing primary education and mandating environmental education could at least allow those that want to engage in government to engage better, or be more capable in what they do. So that was just two things. Do you think that there's a role for public education in the Green New Deal? And do you think that moving towards a localized grid system might be more beneficial for the transition?
Yes.
I don't know. No, in terms of the grid, I think there are so many trade-offs involved in what scale the grid should be. I think that there are more that the distribution of resources is not always entirely equal, and so we want to be able to benefit from a wider grid. On the other hand, we want states to be able to, or local governments to be able to feel like where they want to, they can have some control over their choice of sources and how they operate. So, you know, ultimately, I always strike the middle ground, I think, you know, which is that I think there ought to be some opportunity for more local choices about the kinds of energy you want to rely on and letting people have that freedom. But I still think we need a larger scale grid because I think sometimes it's going to make more sense to be getting wind energy from the plains, right? Rather than expecting your solar to give you energy at night. But if you also want to be doing distributed solar and your car as a backup, that's fine, but you also still need to have the security, I think, of being part of a larger system. And not everybody's going to want to do that. So I don't think there's I think we still need to, I think we can all benefit from some integration of the grid. National, I don't know, right? But some larger geographic scales, I think, are going to make sense in terms of really being able to marshal the renewable resources we have in this country, which are not evenly distributed. So that's on that. The other is education. I think you need to, I'm not sure people need the education. I think people need the opportunity to connect around something specific to them. So I think it's when an issue comes up and you say, I think it's about, we got to make a decision in our community about how we're, going to buy our electricity or who's going to control it. Then that issue comes to the community, and then you work on that issue. I'm not sure that that environmental education, as such, is what will tune people in or out to that. I think I somehow feel like I guess I would prioritize letting people come close to the issues that touch their lives and letting them be able to connect with them. And I'm not sure environmental education is going to be the way to it. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And I also feel like, people who do environment need to be educated in socioeconomic conditions and the way in which the environment connects to everything else. So I think the more things touch people's lives, then the more that they just need to have the opportunity for engagement. I think that's what's critical more than knowing the facts around the environment.
Can I chime in a little bit on the regional grid issue too?
Yeah.
I think it's just interesting to compare how different utilities have made these different types of choices about how and whether to switch. And locally managed municipal utilities, have a greater, you would think a greater degree of local control about making these kinds of decisions, but also have other constraints and don't necessarily have a better track record in transitioning to renewable energy because they may be straddled with long-term contracts for coal power. And this is the case with LA. LA has a long-term coal contract with a coal-fired power plant in central Utah. And until that plant changes over to natural gas, then you're still getting a lot of coal-fired power in Los Angeles. And so there are a lot of constraints with doing that at a local level, but I agree that there are benefits with having things more integrated because you can take advantage of the diverse ways in which those different resources operate.
JB, would you like to contribute anything? I think you're muted.
I don't know how to make a symbol that shows you're muted.
Sorry, I didn't want feedback. So, two observations. Again, I'll go back to the need for speed point. If you don't think that the infrastructure we need to build out for the Green New Deal needs to be faster than usual, then we don't need new green laws either. But I don't think that's the case. First of all, if it's going to be effective. I mean, we have, California HighSpeed Rail is now 2039, I think was the date, right, for LA to San Francisco. If you think of a nationwide HighSpeed Rail, and that is part of the Green New Deal, we'll be talking, in the year, hundreds of years from now before it's built out if we just go with business as usual. 2 points on that. Long linear projects like this, necessarily they go through local community after local community after local community. So there's no way to avoid that, right? It's many local communities, if they are fully participatory under the Green New Deal, will have influence over the routing. It's always a routing question. So we're going to have to figure out how we integrate local preferences into this infrastructure project. And then I was just listening to Alice's point about the need for continued, I think I interpreted this correctly, the continued need for sort of large-scale energy production through wind and solar. And a question arose in my head, and I don't know what the answer is. I'm going to try and find the number. And that would be, how many gigawatts does it take to run our country? We've got a lot of industry that uses natural gas directly. They don't buy electricity from anyone. We have a lot of industry that is buying energy from coal-fired power plants. We have large communities. And I'm just wondering, what's the total number, right? What do we have to generate a year in gigawatts to run our country? And if we're going to transition to wind and solar as the primary sources of energy, I think that number is way too big to do it through distributed energy. It's just way too big, which means we will have to put massive arrays of wind and solar on the ground and off our coast and run electric transmission lines from them to the grid. And enlarge the grid probably to make that happen, much as was the case with Texas CREZ. So there's no just silver bullet here that avoids the infrastructure challenge that's ahead of us. And going back to the original question, the million-dollar question is, how do we do that and make everyone happy? And I don't have an answer to that.
Do we have time for Professor Echevarria to have a question?
This is for JB, so I gotta have mine.
Hey, John, how's the farm going?
Great, you got to come back soon.
He's
Hope
a
so.
beautiful looter.
So I've enjoyed your presentation with Jim. I'm trying to separate in my mind the question of the need for eminent domain and the need for expedited environmental review and the relative importance of those. And I guess one of the, just getting a little more specific, I think one of the things you have talked about quite specifically is the need for transmission lines and transmission corridors to bring offshore energy onshore and to bring solar and wind power to market. As we all know, there is no national transmission siting authority, and there's no associated eminent domain power, unlike, say, with natural gas pipelines. And that's been a matter of debate for decades. And it seems to me that one can make a very, very powerful case for the need for national eminent domain to site transmission lines, period. That we have to follow the model of the Natural Gas Act. I guess I'm less convinced about the need for adopting a border wall approach to environmental law in order to implement the new Green Deal, and that so much of our environmental law has been has evolved to a point where through mitigation banking and offsets and general permits and one thing and another, it's possible to build pretty substantial projects and in compliance with our national environmental laws. So I guess I'm thinking that that the priority ought to be working on eminent domain. And if you're really interested in that, then all you have to do is vote for Donald Trump in 2020, because he's the national leader in promoting eminent domain. I guess I'm more leery of your diagnosis, your prescription for the environmental laws.
No, not doing that in 2020. I mean, I think that's the Green New Deal obviously isn't going to happen if that's the at least not in the time frame that it would be hoped for. So I think that is the tension, right? I mean, if we politically install the kind of politicians who are behind the Green New Deal, they are, I think, inherently antagonistic to the use of eminent domain. So I'm not sure how we actually get to that point of how do we exercise eminent domain for national scale infrastructure. I think it has to be federal. As far as the I agree with you completely. We've evolved environmental law to sort of smooth out the rough edges in a lot of contexts with general permits, mitigation, banking, et cetera. Still, that's all happened in the context of sort of incremental expansion of infrastructure, not the kind of scale that it's unprecedented in the history of modern environmental law to think about how are we going to get a national high-speed rail system? How are we going to put 10,000 more miles of electric transmission lines on the ground? How are we going to build thousands of miles, literally thousands of miles of coastal protection as green as possible? So I think it's a scale issue, John. I mean, I think we've just never done anything like this, and the combination of mitigation banks and green general permits aren't going to get us there.
Thank you. Thank you all, and please join me in thanking our panelists for this interesting, great panel. Andrew, were you planning on closing things out for us? Okay.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye, JB.
Bye, Jim. Thanks, JB. Thank you.
Yeah. Never mind, you got it. Wow, what a symposium. The exploration of this topic has been truly eye-opening. I wanted to thank everyone who came out today and was present for the panels and for our panelists traveling so far. From the reaches of Australia and Hawaii to more local, we appreciate that. I wanted to personally thank Brittany Town, Martina Rutkovsky and the cafe crew, Building and Grounds, Emily Potts, and Bill Bond and the IT crew for all of the logistical support that they invested in this event. We could not have done it without them. I want to thank Colette Schmidt and Professor Hilary Hoffman and Jessica Dowdy for all of the assistance that they gave us in putting this event on. I would like to thank our moderators, Professor Kevin Jones, Dean Jennifer Rushlow, and Dean Lori Bay-Ranavand, for generously donating their time and appearing here today. I would like to thank Sarah Puzo for all of the work that she put into the symposium. She has coordinated most of this from hundreds of miles away in DC, so we really appreciate you working through that. Yeah, me too. I also wanted to thank all of the Vermont Law Review members who have contributed. It was truly a team effort. We have explored decarbonizing our economy, bringing equity and justice to the Green New Deal, and the policy pathways we can take to import the Green New Deal into reality. Our panelists have given us much to think about as we consider our options going forward. This cannot be the end of the process, however. In order to act this Green New Deal, we will have to organize and vote for these individuals who care about our planet and our future. We will need to seize control of the narrative from those who would use our collective home solely for profit. We must work together to bring a sustainable culture to our country and to our world. Only then will we have truly accomplished the aim of the Green New Deal. Until we reach that point, we will keep working. Our opposition will not stop, so why should we? Thank you again for attending this year. We look forward to seeing you next year.